The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. Whatever your view is about American military engagements overseas, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, and my view is quite negative about it, as anybody who's been watching this show for like the last decade would certainly be aware. We still need to sort of be reasonable people as Americans who are occupying forces in different countries around the world. And there was actually a specific program put in place for interpreters who worked alongside U.S. troops and armed forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we go. And of course, we have some local language speakers in the military, but we also rely on the help of locals in these countries to help American troops communicate with the local population. And sometimes this creates a dynamic where those interpreters can be at physical risk if they are identified as sort of collaborating with the occupying force. Sometimes it's just because we sort of feel that we should do something for them. But there was a special visa program created by which they were more easily able to get visas to come to the United States and get their families to safety, particularly in situations where they could be at risk because of the association with American troops. And it turns out that under the Trump administration, the number of people who have been allowed to come to the United States under that visa program has been drastically reduced. And this is, I mean, I don't think, Pat, that this would come as a surprise to anybody because it's part of the sort of immigration approach that the Trump administration has said that they would take. It is in line with everything that Donald Trump said during the lead up to his election. But these really are people who they're working with us. They're working with the American military. And it is yet another one of these, at the macro level, Trump is destroying relationships. And this is something that at the micro level will also make things more difficult for American troops overseas.
Yeah, it's the most egregious and harmful Trump anti-immigration stance that someone could possibly take. Because these people have proven themselves to be on the side of Americans. If they wanted to come over here and kill Americans, well, I think that's kind of unlikely because they had the opportunity to do that before, working within close quarters of these American troops. And they, of course, decided not to do that. They're helping Americans. So for their service, at the very least, they should be offered a visa, maybe even a pathway to citizenship. I think that's totally obvious. The fact that they would be against something like this, that's just crazy to me.
And it's not about being for or against the specifics of what these interpreters are helping American troops to do. This doesn't signal your support or opposition to any particular action by the military. It just goes back to this idea that if the United States is not seen as a reliable negotiating partner or someone, an entity, a nation state whose word can be trusted, this is going to create a trust problem in general for us that will actually have significant negative externalities. The big example diplomatically has been the Iran deal. President Obama got into this Iran nuclear deal. Donald Trump doesn't like the deal, but Iran did not violate it. Iran participated and allowed every sort of verification mechanism that the treaty, that the deal required. And Donald Trump still said the United States is bailing. That's like a macro geopolitical example of if countries see that if you sign something with one president and stick to it, and the next president comes in, and without you having done anything wrong, they say, we're out of that. What incentive is there for people to actually work with the United States? And the exact same thing applies here, Pat, at the micro level with these interpreters and the visa program.
Yeah, and I think that scaling down the visa program actually puts American troops at risk, which Republicans and Trump, they're supposed to be against. And I think that's the case because you're not going to incentivize other locals in these countries to want to become translators and work with the American military if they know that they're going to put themselves and their families at risk working for us, and then maybe we leave and they no longer have our protection, they have nowhere to go, and an enemy combatant could try to capture them and kill them knowing that they worked with Americans. Who's going to want to sign up for that job?
Yeah.
And also, I mean, we do have some Arabic speakers, of course, in our own country who are capable of doing this job, but not that many. There really aren't that many.
We are short on them, I guess is the point. If you listen to what the military says, absolutely. It's geopolitical stupidity at the micro level and geopolitical stupidity at the macro level. You might remember in the old days of the David Pakman Show when we were in Greenfield, Massachusetts, we actually did a segment where former producer Lewis, former TV director Natan, and I ordered edible bugs, which I guess by that I mean just bugs, because they're all conceivably edible. They were seasoned from a Korean company that at the time was sort of the vanguard of insect snacks. And they were pretty vile. I tried like a chocolate covered silkworm, I believe. I didn't go for the grasshoppers, but Lewis and Natan did. And the whole concept of insect protein has become significantly mainstream. There are now more and more places you can go and get grasshopper powder things. I forget exactly what. Do you know, Pat? Is it a Japanese cuisine that you can get the grasshopper powder stuff? I don't remember now.
I haven't seen grasshopper powder, but I have seen cricket protein bars at the grocery store.
You know
I don't
what?
know
That's
how
what I
well
mean.
they sell.
That's what I mean. Yeah, I was.
Oh, okay.
So that's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they sell that well, though.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. But food scientists at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, are now incorporating insects, including maggots and locusts, into a variety of specialty foods, including sausages, as well as formulating sustainable insect-based feeds for livestock themselves. And the idea there is that while grass-fed is the best for much livestock, the insect-based proteins are likely better than like the cereals that a lot of livestock get, which really don't seem to be good. But that's sort of a more micro thing. Here's my reaction to this, okay? I am not super into the idea of switching over to insect protein as a primary protein source for my diet at this point in time. I don't really have any ideological opposition to it. And it's not even really, I mean, I guess it's sort of an ick factor sort of thing, but I'll be honest, based on what we know about the health effects of eating pork products on the basis of the pig's digestive system and the fact that I sort of don't see, I'm not interested in eating whale. I'm not interested in eating dogs. And likewise, on the basis of their sort of sociability and intelligence, I'm also not interested in eating pigs. I would much sooner switch over to something like this, Pat, than I would go back to eating pork.
Well, what if you had the option of a plant-based protein source? Like they do have mock meats, they have mock sausages and hot dogs and all these things that they're trying to make now with insects. Why is it that that's not even a consideration for many people? Like, I wonder if most people, if they were forced into no longer being able to eat cows and chickens and pigs, but they had the option of either going with maggot hot dogs or soy-based hot dogs, which one would they choose? And I honestly don't know, because on the one hand, you have the ick factor when it comes to the insects that I think would scare a lot of people off. But on the other hand, I remember after Hurricane Harvey, there was an image at a Houston grocery store of the mock meat and tofu section, the vegan section of the grocery store, being perfectly intact. It looked like as if no one had touched it. And yet the rest of the grocery store was completely empty because people had raided it for food. So maybe people are more willing to eat insects than they are plant-based protein sources.
Well, I think that there's actually a legitimate health question to ask, and it's a nutrition question, which is some of those plant-based products are heavily soy-based, and there are growing questions about the health effects of eating fermented versus unfermented soy products on the human body. So for me, it wouldn't really be so much the ick factor. Like if you said you can no longer have animal protein, which I have a relatively limited amount of anyway, other than eggs and milk. I mean, I eat red meat probably three or four times a year only. For me, it would be less of an ick factor thing than it's quite possible that grasshopper protein and some of this other stuff is relatively clean, healthy protein with no sort of or limited ancillary possible problems. And with the questions around soy consumption in society, I would actually look more into that, Pat, than sort of like the ideological or ick factor thing.
Yeah, I don't know enough about soy specifically to say, but of course there are other, plant-based protein sources aside from soy that one could look into. Overall, though, do you think that there's too much obsession over people getting enough protein in their diet? Because protein is in everything, even fruit, which you don't consider as a protein source that has like 5% protein or 10% protein. Most people don't need that much protein to sustain their weight, sustain their health. Unless you're trying to like build muscle or something, then I think you're supposed to have about a gram of protein per pound of body weight that you have every day.
That's a lot. Yeah, if you're trying to do
that.
that.
It is quite a lot. And I try to achieve that on a daily basis, I must
I
say.
mean, listen, here's my thought on this. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, but I do try to keep up with the scholarship on this because, higher cholesterol runs in both my mom and dad. So I'm just trying to be conscious of what is the right diet for that. You're right that fruit does contain some protein, but from my understanding, it's more the problem of the ratio of sugars and carbs to protein that is in fruit that would make it potentially problematic to base sort of like your protein consumption around fruit. Nuts, obviously, are sort of a different story. But yeah, I mean, listen, the scholarship, you can always find some study that sort of supports your preconceived notions. And I think unless you really do a good job of looking at the longitudinal studies of studies, it's very difficult to make completely accurate assessments on a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I just pointed out fruit to say that there is protein in fruit, even though you wouldn't think that there would be.
Sure.
Fruit, of course, isn't a good primary source of protein. If you're looking for plant-based options, soy is an option, nuts, and plenty of other things too.
The other day, I tried, not to get off track, this pea protein based Impossible Burger, I think it's called. It wasn't great, but it was definitely the closest texture to ground beef that I've seen of it. Like when you get one of those frozen garden burger patties, like that's obviously not a replacement for a ground beef burger.
Yeah.
But the Impossible Burger was more similar to that. The only weird thing is that it starts looking like raw beef when you start cooking it. And when it's done, it also still looks like raw ground beef. So that's a little bit weird.
And isn't it pricey too? I would imagine the price will come down eventually, but I think that's like the cost factor is kind of concerning for some people.
Yeah, I think it was $7 for a 2-pack, which is definitely more than even like, if you get organic grass-fed beef burgers, I think even those are cheaper than $3.50 a patty. Although I'm not totally sure.
And doesn't it bleed beet juice? That's interesting to me. I haven't had one yet.
If it did, it just went down through the grates of my grill and I didn't notice it. So I was not super exposed to that. The Trump administration has offered its first full argument for a total repeal of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And the government is arguing in these new filings that what's called the individual mandate, which says every American has to have coverage or pay a fine, they're arguing that that's unconstitutional and that it's not just that individual mandate that should be struck down or removed as a result of that, but that actually, because that's the sort of funding mechanism that is required for Obamacare to work, that on the basis of what they say is an unconstitutional individual mandate, the entire Affordable Care Act should be struck down. So this is number one notable because they are emboldened and now they are trying to push for a full repeal of Obamacare again. But remember, last time they did this, it failed miserably because their own replacement plans would have led to tens of millions of Americans ultimately losing their health care. But the other thing that I just find interesting is that we know if we look at history, and if you go to our recent Founding Fathers video that we did, there's nothing unconstitutional about the individual mandate. And I'm thinking back now, Pat, but I believe in that piece I pointed out that very early on, when the founders were actually still in charge, they were totally okay with a system that required sailors and the owners of the ship to both pay towards a socialized single-payer system of care for those sailors. If it was really against what the founders intended, the founders wouldn't have done something that's exactly the same as the mandate.
Yeah, exactly. And that happened in the late 1700s. So they could have litigated that, but I guess it wasn't even seen as something that had to be litigated. They didn't even have to go to the courts over it because it just seemed like it was obviously constitutional. So if it was back then, I think you can make the case that a mandate is now too. So yeah, of course we could get into like sort of the merits of the case here, but I'm actually just surprised that they're trying to do this. Like healthcare right now is ranked as the number one most important issue facing Americans. Does Trump really want to go into 2020 with this accomplishment, I guess, that he was able to strike down the Affordable Care Act, the bill that was able to get so many people coverage, people who are on the exchanges or were able to get coverage because of Medicaid, and they lose their coverage because Trump gets the legislation struck down. they're not going to be inclined to vote for him.
I agree. For me, I'm less interested in the sort of specific argument that's being made in this yet another attempt to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. Like, they've made all the arguments before. So far, it hasn't worked. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. For me, it's the bigger picture of the political implications, especially so close to an election. And there's also another thing, which this has been around now for 9 years. This has been around almost a decade. And we need to sort of move away from the idea of thinking of the Affordable Care Act as this little appendage, like a skin tag on the broader healthcare system. It's been around almost a decade. Like, this is just our healthcare system now. And the idea of just taking the Affordable Care Act and getting rid of it, it's all part of the healthcare system we have. It's not an incredible panacea. It does some good things. It also reinforces the sort of for-profit health insurance industrial complex. And we need to think about reforming the entire system. The idea of just cutting off this skin tag or appendix, removing an appendix, so to speak, of Obamacare is just not realistic at this point, because it's just part of the system that we have. And the system's very problematic, and we need much bigger reforms than just saying, let's get rid of Obamacare. But we'll see if ultimately they prevail in this case, and then we'll evaluate what the political implications would be. That does it for today. New show, new bonus show tomorrow. Welcome to the many new members that joined during yesterday's YouTube live stream. Very, very successful live stream in terms of new members. Welcome to all. Hope you're enjoying the bonus show and your memberships.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.